Okay. Let's begin. Alright, my darlings. Well, it's that time of year again, the time when the leaves be falling, the pumpkins be carving, and the costumes be scything. But for me, it's time to remember those times from our childhood where we shouldn't have been scared, but we were. Last year I did a video called Top 10 Unintentionally Scary Kid Shows, talking about kids' entertainment that wasn't supposed to be scary, but for one reason or another, it just was. And it's become one of my most popular videos. That is until Screen Rant ripped me off. Though if they did actually rip me off, that is actually kind of flattering, but I doubt they had any idea about my video when they made theirs. But of course, many people were quick to point out many shows that they also thought were scary, but I didn't include. So in order to pick up those stragglers, and a few more shows that I thought were scary but I couldn't include the first time, this is the top 10 more unintentionally scary kid shows. So let us begin. And remember,
don't have nightmares now.
No, not the original series. I'm not so unoriginal to have a slot on this list be taken up by one that was on the last list. No, I mean the new series that came out a few years ago. Or rather, a particular part of the new series. As you can imagine, I didn't really care for the new series when it came out. I may have watched the original series in a Pavlovian sense of continually breaking my psyche, but being 21 at the time and having gotten enough nightmare fuel from the previous series, I felt no need to watch the new one. And thank God I didn't, because the stuff they added to this series makes the stuff from the previous series seem like bedtime story material in comparison. I did take a quick look at the new series for posterity, and it's mostly what I expected. It's the original series on a slightly bigger budget, which in many ways makes it look more cheap, if that makes any sense, since the overabundance of cheesy CGI effects, lens flares, and an even worse looking sun baby. I wonder if there'll be memes about what this sun baby looks like in 20 years' time. It just makes it look like they're not bothering as much with this series. It's the CBeebies equivalent of the Star Wars prequels, not helped by how the Teletubbies now speak English with better pronunciation.
2, 3, 4.
Which, I don't know if that makes them more or less creepy, and this all comes to great exemplification with the new thing that they added. Which is something that was brought to my attention by a picture that people kept sending me after the last video came out, and it's forced me to confront something that before I would never even dare think about, but is now a reality. The Teletubbies can breed.
The Tiddly-Tubbies were coming to play. Dada, Umby-Pumby, Bar, and Pink.
All my worst nightmares have come true at once, and made even more terrifying babies. These horrifying CGI abominations are the Teletubbies' kids. I guess. They don't really explain where they come from, which to be honest is kind of a good thing. But in my mind, or Night Terrors really, is that those things on their heads are now multifunctional and do more than receive TV signals. Another image that'll be hard to get out of your heads after I've put it in there, patented HeadphonesUK nightmare fuel. Though I get the feeling that with Rule 34 that someone's made that concept a visual reality, which would be one hell of a special episode. Well, now that I've traumatized you with that concept, let's ruminate on this one for a little bit. Have you ever noticed that in the Teletubbies world, anything only happens after the narrator says that it's going to happen?
One day in Teletubbyland, it was time for Tubby Custard.
Tubby Custard?
The Tubby Custard ride was about to begin. The lights went out. The Tubby Custard ride was over.
So does that make him the puppet master, or the god of this world? Because if that's the case, I think the Sunbaby's going to take exception to him muscling in on his turf. Especially since he's gotten worried that these Hellspawn are going to try and usurp him in the future, for it has been written in the Teletubbyland Chronicles that when more Teletubbies appear, the days of the Sunbaby are numbered. Whoever had this idea for the new Teletubbies series is someone who clearly hates kids and wants to mentally torture them as punishment, and clearly has a lot of issues they need to sort out, much like how anybody who watches these things will have after seeing them for the first time. But at least it shows that the Teletubbies can be consistent in their reboot by being able to scare the shit out of us while trying to be cute at the same time. Though at the very least I'm thankful that the bear and the lion and that creepy house puppet never showed back up again.
I am the scary lion.
Number 9. The Boo Bars.
And here's the one that everyone complained wasn't on the last list, and here it is now. And yes, I did see this show a little when I was a kid and have some memories of it, but because it was on CITV, I barely watched it and thus barely have any memories of it either. So thank you, commenters from last year's video. You brought back the memory of this horrifically disturbing kids show. I've knocked CITV for many things in the past, but one of the few things I'll give them credit for is that they're definitely original. Very few of the shows they ever made were rip-offs of kids shows you'll see on other networks, even if their Monty Python / Terry Gilliam style sense of humour on some of their shows were a bit off colour for kids' entertainment. But here, it's just a rip-off of Teletubbies, no question about it, and leave it to CITV to figure out a way to make the Teletubbies even more terrifying. Firstly, let's replace this slightly creepy but also somewhat endearing gibberish that the Teletubbies had with a voice that sounds like what would happen if the Jawas from Star Wars ever took helium and ecstasy at the same time, and a really off-putting clicking noise to go along with it too. So does that mean the Boo Bars are actually robots? Are those things that they sleep in actually charging stations? Next, let's make them look like what E.T.'s genitals probably look like, and then give them all different colours, so this show resembles some sort of intergalactic STD awareness campaign. Yeah, they never told you this on the show, but when their heads pop out of their bodies, that means they're fully erect.
Seriously?
What?
I just heard you get hard.
Next, let's have a bunch of kids off screen constantly shout their names and have their names be the most ridiculous sounding things ever, so it sounds more like they're on a sugar high while trying to understand Swahili.
Hamba! Zumba! Bing, bing, ding, ba!
And finally, let's make the presentation as off-putting as possible by constantly having out-of-place sound and video effects, and boom! You've got a show that is quite possibly the exact adaptation of what's going on in Keith Richards' head at this very moment. With less pirates and shrunken heads, of course. As for the content of the show, well, that's the hardest thing to describe. As mindless as Teletubbies was, at least it had nice looking locations, sets and props that gave it a bit of a calming, nurturing environment that, even during some of the creepiest moments, made you feel a little at ease. With this, it's even less cognitively challenging. Basically, each episode can be summed up with the description of kids wake up the Boo Bars do a random thing whilst making fart noises, and then makes you question everything about life on the concept of these walking rainbow-coloured gonads having arseholes. Then the kids show up and blow something up a Stargate whilst butchering their lines so badly you can't even understand what they're saying.
A present for the starry people!
Then cut to a set piece outside the Boo Bars world, much like the stomach TV interludes of a certain other show. Then the Boo Bars do something random again, go back to their charging stations, go flaccid, and then return back to Asgard via their rainbow bridge. I feel like taking shrooms right now would actually give me a fantasy that's more down to earth than what this show provides. Rewatching this show as an adult is one of the most obscene things I've ever had to do for this show. Watching it for a long time, I genuinely felt like my brain was floating away, and after a while, I didn't know if I wanted to scream, cry, or laugh. Much like when I watched Love Island, though when watching this show, it results in much less swearing. Actually, I take it back, it results in more swearing.
Number 8. The Cubies.
Now here's a show that I didn't have to be prompted to remember, but it wasn't on the last list because, well, with only 10 slots, something had to be left out. Once again, returning to the well-trodden font of CITV, Cubies was an educational show involving sentient cubes with compartments in their heads? It's hard to say if that is their head because their whole body is just a cube with a face and arms on it. So kind of like how I'll look in 20 years time. I can't deny that I did genuinely like this show when I was a kid, and part of me still does. It reminded me a lot of when you make doodles in math class, because the world that the Cubies live in does have a sense of childlike creativity to it, with new things appearing out of random, but still having some sense of consistency to it with things like the skeeters, a term that had a much different meaning with the rappers of the time. You made it skeet, skeet, skeet. And the seeds that change the terrain on the whim. It's genuinely quite an imaginative show, and the voice acting's pretty good too, but it all still comes down to how these derp-faced geometry Frankenstein monsters are the focal point of it. Couldn't they just make them look a little less creepy? How about making them look human or humanoid with magic bags that they pull things out of, like Mary Poppins? Or Deadpool? Or if they wanted to stick with the shape theme, have them morph into shapes when they want to, not have them like that all the time. But I think the major problem with this series comes down to those faces. Why does the blue one always have his eyes half closed, and that off-putting smirk on their faces that they have all the time? They look like they want to kill me. Well, except for that one with the glasses, she suffers from resting bitch face. A condition which I also suffer from. To be fair, it's par for the course with early 2000s CGI kid shows, but that doesn't negate its creepiness, and quite frankly, if the Grim Reaper looked like these guys, I think we'd all be a little bit more scared of death. But when they come for us, we could always just do this.
Not today, matey. Remember, only the good die young.
Number 7. Nelly Nut.
For all the times I've spent harrowing at CITV, Channel 4 and other kids-based networks, we can't forget that CBC was also capable of giving us nightmares about things we didn't know we could have nightmares about. Nelly Nut was one of, if not the only attempt I can think of an animated interactive show. What I mean by this is how the show was primarily focused on viewers calling in and using voice commands to play games and win prizes. There were lots of examples of kids shows that were like this on the BBC, like Smile, The Saturday Show, and even Dick and Dom had some phone-in games that were like this. But Nelly Nut decided to be overly ambitious and have it be animated at the same time. So yes, this is technically the world's first live animated show. Sort of. You see, unlike the illusion that the Flintstones tried to make of their show being animated before a live audience, instead they had a series of pre-made digitally animated set pieces and control what order and what actions would happen in reaction to what the viewers calling in would say. Basically, it's the animated equivalent of those phone-in storytime hotlines you saw all the time in the 80s and 90s. Though, ironically, I didn't imagine the people on the other line looking this creepy. Seriously, of all the styles you could have gone with, this was the one you chose? A girl who looks like she's been hit with the Joker's smile gas while eating a fly? Who almost never seems to blink and has eyes that are half the size of her head? And that's not even getting into how creepy her friends look. Some guy who looks like Carrot Top after taking too much cocaine and about to go on a killing spree. This guy who, I've got to be honest, looks a lot like Gary Coleman, a blonde Igor wearing a football scarf, and your typical long-haired sweater goth girl from the early 2000s. And yep, they all look terrifying as well. They all look like the characters from Recess if they were drawn by Gerald Scarfe. And then there's the obnoxious voice of Nelly Nut herself.
Now that's Nelly here, and this is my fluffy bundle of bear Miss Bunny!
All the very best!
And this is my cool new show, live on the CBBC channel!
Line it up.
Ready to fire, press 5, that's it. Okay then,
Here we
press
go.
1 to 9 and you keep on now.
So we go for a sit down and a spin round like a corkscrew.
I will never complain about Tara Strong's voice acting again. I get that the voice actors had to react off of whatever the callers were saying, so it was often very loose in terms of its formatting, but that doesn't mean you have to scream into the microphone every time there's dead space. It's okay to have a bit of silence, you know. Especially since this isn't radio, you have visuals to fill in the gaps. Just give the poor listeners a break, because right now, I'd rather listen to Weasel's singing voice than yours right now. Also, I'd heard rumours that comedian and actor Greg Davis was the voice of Nelly's Welsh-accented bear, but I think at this point he was still an actual drama teacher, but I'd love to think that it was him, because he'd be a safe, friendly face to cling to in all of this horror, and bearing in mind that he acted like this in Inbetweeners.
Thanks for that, Phil.
Phil?
It's just because the dance is outside of school time, so I assumed.
Well, you assumed wrong, Will.
And yet that's still less scary than this.
Say bye-bye, bunny breath!
black and blue!
Maybe his detention method was to force his students to watch Nelly nut until their minds broke.
Say my name properly.
Mr. Gilbert.
Say thank you.
Thank you.
Say thank you, Mr. Gilbert.
The only thing that's scarier than this is the show that was on right before it on CBC. And what was that, you ask? Let's go to the next number to find out.
Number 6. Arthur.
Arthur was one of the longest running kid shows of the 2000s. Why, I don't know. It's basically just a repackaged version of Doug with characters that are supposed to look like animals, but the creators clearly didn't care. I mean, hell, the main character is meant to be an aardvark, and yeah, you can really tell that the moment you look at him, can't you? Or perhaps they're not really animals, and this is actually the same world from Doug, it's just that whatever chemical spill caused the characters to have different coloured skin further mutated them to have animal features. Hey, it makes about as much sense and it's as creepy as everything else in the series. A lot of people have mixed opinions on Arthur. Some say it was a great show that taught valuable life lessons, others saying that it was an overwrought and very disturbing show that stuck around for way too long. Given that it's on this year's list, you can probably guess where my thoughts lie. In fairness, I did watch this show a whole lot and enjoyed it as a kid, but I can't deny that one of the things that always rubbed me the wrong way was the fantasy sequences, since they were so overdramatic and occasionally creepy that it freaked me out as a kid. Often Arthur and his friends during many moments in episodes would retreat into their own imaginations, much like any kid would normally do. However, in this instance, it's an adult trying to figure out what a kid might be imagining, so combined an attempt to be imaginative with a crippling sense of responsibility, and a dash of wanting to scare kids to learn their heavy-handed life lessons, and you've got the perfect recipe for grade A nightmare fuel. Especially that episode where DW was learning about spelling and language.
Calling people names can be dangerous to their health.
Don't call people names, kids.
Or we'll fucking kill you.
It's also ironic since the same company that made this show also aided in the making of Mona the Vampire, a show that was deliberately meant to be a bit frightening, and yet was nowhere near as disturbing as this show. Though I think that anyone who watched this show enough times can safely say that hearing the theme song still sends shivers up their spine in one way or another.
Every day when you're walking down the street, everybody that you meet, and I say, hey, what a wonderful kind of day.
Thank you, Ziggy Marley, for making a theme that is both ungodly catchy and horrifyingly annoying at the same time. Though can anyone explain to me why when he cameos in the series he plays a moose? That still confuses me. Why would a guy from the islands be portrayed by a moose?
Number 5. Bob the Builder.
With the CGI boom of the 2000s, many classic stop-motion shows have been reborn into CGI, and while thankfully shows such as Birth of the Lovely Machine and Trumpton have remained unharmed, sadly Fireman Sam has been CGI'd, and it sucked. Though compared to who's on this list, I'd gladly watch his entire series over this. One of my favourite stop-motion working-class themed programmes as a kid was Bob the Builder, not just because, like the previous shows I mentioned, it was very endearing with a great way of adapting a very blue-collar job, though to be fair with a bit more whimsy and imagination than Postman Pat and Fireman Sam, since they never had talking machines or living scarecrows in them, but also how the main character shares the same name and job as my dad. No, I'm not kidding. My dad's name is Bob, and he's a carpenter, aka a builder. Though if the show was based off my dad, it would be a very different show. Robert, the self-employed carpenter and woodworks engineer. Can he fix it? Not before he's had a sandwich and a cup of coffee first. But enough about my dad. We're here to talk about a different butchered reboot. In 2015, a new company bought the rights to Bob the Builder and revamped it for a new generation. And like Fireman Sam and Postman Pat before him, Bob got a shiny new CGI redesign. Sorry, did I say shiny? I meant scary. I have seen the eyes of Satan, and they stared back into my soul. Seriously, what was wrong with Bob's old design? It was fine for the show, and it fit with the aesthetic and the designs of the machines. Hell, even Postman Pat the movie kept the designs of its characters close to what it originally looked like, and it looked fine. Though, to be fair, the machines did get redesigned as well, and they do still look relatively similar to their original designs, though their personalities certainly aren't in check. But if someone told me out of the blue that this is what Bob the Builder's machines now look like, I would have been fine with it. It would have been a bit weird, but I can see the original characters in those designs. But when you see Bob, Wendy, Mr. Bentley and this token black guy here, you start to think how long it's been since the last series, when they suddenly look like Playmobil figures who have been brought to life with blood rituals and had human eyes implanted onto them. And how ironic is it that considering the original series characters had those Winnie the Pooh style dot eyes, and yet they were still more expressive than this? The only solace I have for this series is that they didn't include Spud this time, which I say thank God to. Not that I don't like Spud, he was alright, but you can imagine how horrific he would have looked in this new style. It may just top Wurzel Gummidge for being the creepiest living scarecrow in a kids show I've ever seen. It says a lot when the Robot Chicken parody of Bob the Builder is much less disturbing than the rebooted series itself.
Don't forget to wear your safety goggles.
Ah, thanks, Bob.
Number 4. Horrible Science.
And once again we return to the well-trodden font of CITV, with again one of the few times they actually specifically ripped off CBBC for a show. Now, to be fair, the TV series of Horrible Science was based off of a book series of the same name, just like Horrible Histories. However, the parallel between show and book is quite skewed, as the books, compared to their historical equivalent, were quite intense for a children's book, reveling in showing how much of the gruesome detail of the facts of life as they possibly could. And while Horrible Histories was a gory book series as well, its good sense of humour, plus the amazing illustrations by Martin Brown, were able to combine horror and humour perfectly. It took the cut out of those rough edges a bit. Horrible Science, though, just didn't give a shit, almost literally, and showed you everything, no matter what. But at least it wasn't as boring as Murderous Maths. Yes, that was an actual thing. You'd be surprised the amount of Horrible Histories rip-offs there were in the early 2000s. But funnily enough, the TV series, which I had to check out specifically for this episode, since I wasn't even sure it even existed at first, as information on it is so minuscule, it doesn't even have its own Wikipedia page, it's just part of the Horrible Science book page. That's how much people don't give a shit about this series. But its format was even more suspect, as Horrible Histories brilliantly went along with a sketch show format to accommodate all the different eras of history without having to link them together into one narrative. The Horrible Science show decided to go for a sitcom format. To be fair, I've seen much worse setups for sitcoms, but who looked at this children's science book franchise and thought, let's turn this into a sitcom? It'd be like turning those 4 Dummies series of books into a reality TV show. Although I guess with all those Joey Essex shows, that has become a reality. The setup for this series, however, is basically just a bunch of scientists shrinking themselves down to observe things as they happen on a microscopic level. Though despite that, it's nowhere near as fun as Ant-Man and Wasp. But more bizarre than that is the 2 hosts of the show. Most of the hosts are just regular, forgettable 20-somethings as you'd expect, but then there's this rejected RoboCop prototype, and most terrifyingly of all, a talking brain and spine voiced by Alexander Armstrong, who ironically looks a lot like Kane's brain from RoboCop 2.
I think it makes me look like a bit of a hunk.
A hunk of what, Professor?
The point is, I won't need you ferrying me about and whatnot. From now on, we can just stay out of each other's way.
Again, who looked at the Horrible Science series and thought that would represent it well? I get that they wanted their own mascot like Horrible Histories had the talking rat, but that actually made sense in context of the series. I guess you could argue that this does too, as the brain is the genesis of science, but you don't have to make it look that garish. The talking head on a spine from Braindead looked less creepy than that. And if you thought that the series couldn't possibly get more gross than that, then I give you 4 turds singing about themselves. Yes, literally.
Ever wondered where your food goes? Is this a downpipe? Am I off to the sea? Caught in a U-bend, no escape from the lavatory.
Not since Dreamcatcher have I been so scared to take a dump.
Number 3. series.
Here's yet another show I used to watch as a kid and never thought I would talk about again as an adult. Yes, the Bratz, aka Millennial Barbies, did in fact get their own TV series, and while you may think it was just a waste of time, take it from me, someone who accidentally turned onto it whilst it was playing on CITV, where else, one day, and got sucked into it and couldn't stop watching, I can verify it's nothing like you'd imagine it being. However, the show didn't drag you in because it was legitimately good. At least I don't think it was. It's genuinely hard to tell if this show was good or bad. It sucked you in because of how creepy it was. Early and mid-2000s CGI shows were in a bit of an awkward grey area in terms of their timeline. Not as enjoyably awkward looking as 90s CGI animated shows, but not as good looking as 2010 CGI shows either. So we had this odd middle ground at the time where it didn't look bad enough to be funny, but not good enough to be captivating. But when you look as creepy as the Bratz do already, you kind of cross one of those lines and beyond before you've even started animating. The Bratz dolls got complaints from day one on how they looked and how they presented an image of beauty towards children, with their massive heads and eyes, their fat pouty lips, ultra thin but still really curvy bodies. They're like a mix between a 90s porn star and Pumpkinhead. So have these designs in the show where the animation wasn't charming enough to make them look natural or enjoyable, it just created a really odd and uncomfortable feel, and don't get me started on the villains, who are basically just Valley Girl Barbies, making the subtext of the two companies' rivalries much less subtle.
Finally, those monstrous little brats have made their fatal mistake. A sleepover! I will crush them like the worms they are!
Your business must really be failing if your #1 goal right now is to ruin a bunch of teenagers' slumber party. I think even Elon Musk is telling you to get your priorities straight. Not to mention, this was a time when people in CGI animation would pay really close attention to certain details, but not always the right ones. Take this episode for example. Blonde Brat and one half of Jedward here, what, do you expect me to memorise their names, are dirt bike racing on Harleys. When they stop, Blonde Brat's hair is waving about with great detail, at least great detail for a mid-2000s TV show, yet neither one of them have a single speck of dirt, dust or mud on them. Or even their bikes for that matter. Not to mention the fact that the characters' lips would never sync up with what they were saying most of the time, and also their faces would sometimes have no emotion, didn't exactly help the creep factor.
I said we'd hang tonight. Is that cool with you?
Oh yeah, very cool. If you define cool as totally reeking, that is.
He's probably making that face because, much like myself, he's wondering how she managed to get all of her hair back into that helmet so quickly. You might be asking what the story of this series was, but honestly there's not much to tell in that regard. It's basically the same Saved by the Bell high school drama you've seen a million times, mixed in with how these adolescent characters who are still in high school also run their own fashion magazine, so much to the point that a genuine fashion magazine is threatened by their presence. These girls could give the Power Rangers a run for their money in how much they think a teenager can fit into their daily schedule. Normally it's just eating, sleeping, video games and masturbation. Which, to be fair, that's still my daily schedule. And their rival is this thing that kind of looks like Jane Lynch if she took fashion tips from Paris Hilton, and her two interns who actually do look like Paris Hilton, or perhaps the Barbie twins after falling on hard times, while speaking a bunch of awful dialogue that in no way syncs up with their lip movements. Plus, there's some parts in the show where things would happen that would just make you say,
Do you know who I am? Of your thing. Magazine of fashion.
what the fuck am I watching?
Number 2. Jimmy Neutron, boy genius.
This show's reason for creeping me out is basically the same as the previous entries. Creepy designs mixed with dated and subpar CGI graphics, but this one went the extra mile in creepiness by having a large focus on gross out humour and having the show's environment be as bleak and colourless as possible. Jimmy Neutron originally started off as a theatrical film, which, yeah, that's one way of making people like your show concept, put the horror up on the big screen, but it eventually made it to a TV series as part of Nickelodeon's big 2000 resurge of cartoons alongside Fairly Odd Parents, SpongeBob and Invader Zim, and while some may say that Invader Zim is scary, Which, to be fair, it is. It was kind of intended to be a bit frightening. I mean, the creator's previous work was called Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, for crying out loud. What did you expect? But at least I got enjoyment out of Invader Zim. Jimmy Neutron is a show that is not only creepy, but it's not even enjoyable for me. This never really felt like a show to me. It felt more like a bad fever dream while being plugged into Windows Vista. Plus, it's always a sad state of affairs when you have Rob Paulsen, one of the greatest voice actors of all time, do a voice that makes you want to punch him in the face.
That's why I'm bulking up on carbs, because I'll have to feed off the extra weight until the spring. And when I emerge, I will be fit, strong, and my sunburn will be gone.
Why, Rob? You've done so many great voices. Yakko, Pinky, Snowball, Raphael, Donatello. And your first venture into 2000s animation was this wheezy snotbag. To be fair, a lot of people grew up on this show, so they have a lot of fond memories for it, and I can understand that. We've all got those shows that, through our exposure to them, their rougher edges seem a little less rough. But sadly, since I was not one of them, this will forever be a show that I can't help but shudder every time I see it. I think it's really just the presentation for me though. Nickelodeon's made a living out of making wacky, crazy, off-the-wall and gross shows for years before this. Hell, this show isn't too different from shows like Ren and Stimpy, Rocko's Modern Life or Hey Arnold. And that's not to say that those shows didn't have their creepy elements either, but something about the familiar comfort of 2D animation makes it feel more welcoming. And that's not to say CGI can't do that either, but at this point, non-theatrical CGI definitely didn't acquire its soul yet. It definitely required a few more sacrifices to count CGI before that happened. But when Cartoon Network at the time had a Boy Genius show that looked like this, and Nickelodeon's one looked more like this, you can kind of understand why people tended to go for the former. Though this will still never wipe the memory of the time Jimmy Neutron first did a crossover with Fairly Odd Parents.
Whoa! Hey, why is everything so bulgy?
Cut to the next one! Cut to the next one!
And the number one more unintentionally scary kid show is...
any cartoon that was made in the 1930s. This may seem a little bit odd to you guys, but when you had an entire channel at number one on your last list, you have to think of a way to up the ante. So how about an entire decade's worth of animation on this list? And to be honest, it was either this or talk about Elsagate, and I'm not going near that piping hot mess if you paid me. Of course, YouTube does not, and yet they pay them, which is messed up. You may have noticed that most of the slots on this year's list have been taken up by shows that came from the early 2000s and the late 90s, and while they certainly had a capacity of scaring children when they didn't mean to, the 1930s have got them all beat. Some people complain that some of the elements in Cuphead were a little bit too creepy for a kid's game. For those of you who say that, you clearly haven't seen the actual cartoons that they were trying to emulate. That's actually quite tame in comparison. To be fair, back in those days, when you made cartoons, you weren't necessarily making them for kids, but they were still intended for all audiences. But that didn't stop people showing them to kids decades later and traumatizing them for years to come. And anybody who grew up watching the VHS copies of old Disney movies knows that they tended to sneak a couple of their old and creepy cartoons onto there as well. For some people, when they think of creepy moments associated with Dumbo, they'll always think of the pink elephants. And while that is creepy, for me, it's the Three Little Pigs cartoon with the spanking machine that they put on the end of it. That's the thing that I'll always remember. And then of course there's the classic skeleton dance, which most of you probably know now because of the spooky scary skeletons meme. But again, that's also quite tame compared to what you could have seen back then. Do you want to see how bad it really could have gotten back then? Take a look at this.
If I had a gun, I'd shoot myself.
Frog croaking.
Only joking, it's not even a real gun. I mean, if it was a real gun, would I actually load it and point it at my... Well, mistakes have been made. Hey guys, me here. I just came in at the end of the video to tell you two things. The first thing, of course this isn't a real gun. I mean, obviously it isn't, though I just wanted to verify that because it does look quite realistic. But this is actually just an airsoft gun that I bought a couple of weeks back, and originally this part on the grip and the slide, originally they were painted blue, but I spray painted them black. And just to prove that it's not real, it might be hard to see this if I put this into the camera, but you may see here that there's a little extra barrel inside of the barrel here. Obviously real guns don't have that. And the magazine here, as you can see, it's far too small for it to actually fit any actual bullets into it. And there's a little button on the back here and a hole on the bottom for the gas compressor. So obviously this isn't a real gun, but even if it was a real gun, or if it isn't, don't do that at home. It's really stupid, because even airsoft guns, because I don't have any ammo, but it's deliberately not got any in it, because even if I did load that and point it at my head and shoot myself, it would really hurt, because airsoft guns are not as painless as you might think they are. But yeah, just wanted to verify that. Either whether it's a real gun or a fake gun, don't load it and point it at your head. But with that safety announcement out of the way, I just wanted to come in to tell you and wish you a very, very happy Halloween. I always do like this time of year, even though we don't really do anything in it here in the UK. But yeah, so with that said...
Happy Halloween.
Spooky, scary skeletons and shivers down your spine. Shrieking skulls will shock your soul